what is the thing that I'm studying? Welcome everyone. My name is Kim Larson. I'm a client success manager here at Luminoso. And today we're going to go over what you need to know about how to use daylight for KPI tracking, pairing, sentiment, and drivers. Today we'll be doing that by going over concept perspectives. We know that there's a lot of concepts in daylight and there's a lot of things that get thrown at you all at once. So how do we start to shift those into categories to make those concepts meaningful? And we're going to look at the metrics that are drivers, metrics that we would pull out a sentiment. And then we have a sample orchards and analysis deliverables. If you watch the ChatGPT webinar, you'll see that's a familiar reference. And then we'll go over some steps and best practices for finalizing your deliverables before you turn it in to make sure that you're upholding level of research integrity that you want. If you guys are completely new to daylight, volume and galaxy features cover what's in my data. The pure facts of how often was something mentioned. We have layers with prevalence of how uniquely common is something mentioned, and what is associated to what is being used frequently in conjunction with other concepts or synonymously as other concepts, resulting in these clusters. The part that we're focusing on today is the so what. So how are people feeling? What words are being used to articulate those feelings? Is this thing that's being mentioned the silver lining to a terrible story? Is it everything was bad except this one person in customer service did something nice? Or is this the one disappointment in an otherwise fantastic experience? It was, amazing, 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 amazing. I just wish one thing was slightly different. With pairing drivers and sentiment, you can take those concepts and those ideas and then flip them back into volume or galaxy to see if this is an emerging frustration, an emerging silver lining, or if it's decreasing. So we want to dive into how often is perfect being mentioned with my brand versus other brands, or which beers are being described as oily and what are those average scores. Concept perspective. This example of a beverage. The beverage has flavor, it has a smell, it has foam, it has pour. Those things are going to have varying degree of interest depending on how much you understand about the beverage. If you are a beverage expert already, these are not new. But if you're discovering something that you haven't explored before and you need to figure out what the different elements of those are, that's when the how becomes interesting. Next to that, we have the is. The beverage is delicious, putrid, terrible, amazing, lots of ways to describe it. So depending on what your interests are or what your stakeholders' needs are in the discovery phase, you're going to gravitate towards one or the other. If you're doing a full report, you may need to report on both, but you want to understand that there's two lenses to the subject. So let's do another example. There's a product. We have Teddy. It has purpose, it has quality, it has packaging, it has price, but it may be described as other things. It is soft, it is loved. If it has rips, if it has stains, these are different elements of the product. Sometimes we get a little bit more advanced and we're working with HR and we need to figure out, well, what does it mean to work here? What is the culture, compensation, tasks, responsibilities? The discovery phase gets a little bit more complex if you don't understand what the culture of a specific company is. If you're working with a bunch of different use cases, you want to have that grounding on what is the thing that I'm studying. And then we want to surface the vocabulary of the consumers or the stakeholders that are experiencing the thing. Is the employment enriching, challenging, meaningful, stressful? What are the stresses? We want to dive into that. To do that with daylight, we use subjects and we look at the metrics. So in volume, we'll see what was mentioned most commonly, what was associated with what are the clusters, that is a volume and galaxy thing. We covered that in a previous webinar. And we also have the metrics. If the beer is delicious or sour, we don't know if sour is good or bad all the time. It depends on what it is. Maybe we bought the sour candy. Maybe the thing has gone sour and that's an indication that it's gone bad. We want to be able to look at those in both drivers and sentiment to be able to assess whether those things are good or bad. From here, we can start to make assertions based on the data. So we can see for beverage X, the flavor had a net sentiment of positive 75 versus beverage Y, where maybe it had a net sentiment of negative 32 for flavor. Then we can start to assess, okay, well, the flavor in one is better than the other. That starts to get meaningful for your stakeholders. So let's make sure we understand what we're doing in drivers. The prerequisite for drivers is having score data, but we've also seen folks use any linear numerical data. So daylight doesn't cap what those numbers are. If it's 1 to 5, 0 to 10, 0 to 100, negative 100 to 100, you can get fancier and do things like, if you have the data available, family size, that's an uncapped linear number. Family of 1, family of 13, family of more. It doesn't really matter for daylight. What it's going to do is it's going to associate the things that were mentioned in the text with the linear numerical value associated with it. So you can get pretty creative with that. So what are drivers? So drivers are scores linked to the subset of documents containing that concept, and it's looking for tighter clusters of linear numerical data. It will come up with suggestions. It has a confidence threshold based on how consistent the data is. And with that, it will start to make suggestions. So for beer, it identified that watery was associated with lower scores, whereas mentions of perfect were associated with higher scores, and it states the average here. If you are familiar with beer, this may not be interesting, but watery could be a good thing if you're working with watercolors. From here, this will show us the concept or the term that's being analyzed, the average score. So if they mentioned watery, on average, the satisfaction score, the overall score was 3.3. It gives us the difference from the overall average score. So it's about half a point lower on this 5-point scale. And it gives us the number of total matches. Same thing for perfect. So looking into, when I say total matches, what does that mean? It means it's pulling in the conceptual matches. So perfect is one way to describe it, but the idea of the concept is more vague, right? Because it's using the terms synonymously or in conjunction with each other. So it's pulling in these terms like excellent, wonderful, perfectly, superb, perfection, and the list goes on. You can't see how long the scroll bar is, but it goes down quite a ways. And as a researcher that's trying to understand something in language, I would not want to come up with every word that people are describing perfect. It's this, exalted state of the beer that's resulting in this higher average score, and that's what I want to understand ultimately. Same thing with watery. Watery sounds a bit more specific, but in the beer data, it's communicating this idea of bland, lifeless, unappealing, limp, slimy, runny, brackish. There's a lot of ways to describe watery beer, and this pulls in all of those adjectives when it's deciding what the driver watery means. So the score can be a little bit more helpful. So an example of a driver prompt candidate could be identify 4 takeaways you had about the product. Rate the product. We get these answers, we get these words, we get the 4 stars. So this is where we can start to see maybe soft and kid loved is associated with higher than average scores, whereas ripped may take the score down a little bit. And based on the variation of the feedback, the drivers will vary with that. So cleans easily. I put this one in here because it's a concept that is a collocation. It has 2 terms in it, but if it's used consistently in the data, it will be identified as its own concept in the science. So cleans easily be a higher driver than other forms of easily, like package opened easily, whatever the product applicable is. Let's go look at sentiment and make sure we understand what's going on here. Sentiment suggested concepts. Instead of extrapolating from the linear numerical data associated with that response, it's looking just at the language of the text. So if you don't have metadata and you're getting really rich storyful text, sentiment's going to be a really good place to go. So in this example, we have oily, mostly negative in the beer data, and drinkable as mostly positive to reflect stronger sentiment. We also have neutral sentiment, and that's more statement of fact. The standalone statement that we'll cover here of oily, period. They weren't injecting emotion into oily. They weren't judging it as much as the negative example, heavy, oily in the mouth, coat the tongue, overwhelming. They were putting more emotion around it, so the sentiment's going to reflect that. In the positive example, excellent balance of rich, oily malt and dry hops, perfect texture, creamy. This person liked oily. Once you have these sentiment elements, this may not necessarily be the interesting thing that you want to deliver to your stakeholders, and you want to show something that's a bit more narrative based. We can take it over to a polarization or net sentiment axes and start to plot, like, what is a bad thing, what is a good thing, and what's a little bit more controversial or a statement of fact in this neutral territory. If the pure sentiment breakdowns, positive, neutral, negative, are not enough, this is a nice way to tell the story in other ways. To reflect, we have the subjects, and now we have these metrics, really specifically watery, perfect, oily, and drinkable. Orchard's End is my fake Portland dream cider house that we made up recently. So we made up some reviews to put together a sample deliverable. So I have this 5-star review mentioning service being great, pretzels being delicious, location being awesome, recognizing it's a bit expensive. Then we flip it over to a negative review where person may or may not be named Gollum mentioned a long wait time, the fish was overcooked, probably cooked at all, but pleasantly surprised that the beverages come in pints. Now we have our Orchard's End cider house with specific subjects mentioned. So we have the price, which is innately neutral. It is the subject. My Orchard's End has the things have a price. The service is something that is expected and given. Location, more specifically meat and pints. The descriptions that were used to describe those things included expensive, delicious, overcooked, and awesome. So from here, you may want to take it over to drivers. And I'll have these concepts where I have insights like everyone's mentioning price. It's a really common thing, but some people think it's expensive. Some people think it's, a good value. If everyone's talking about it, regardless of their experience, that's going to average it out and kind of wash it out to a high volume, but a relatively average driver, because there's a wider skew of numbers there. Whereas if it's more niche, where people are only mentioning it because it stuck out as part of like a polarized experience, like if it was negative, they may get more into the details. So meat, if people aren't thinking about it because it wasn't a problem for them, that's going to take the volume of mentions a bit lower, and we're going to see it kind of spread out there. Whereas in this example, we also have pints, where everything was great, but this really stuck out as a wow factor. We'll see it on the lower end of the volume scale, but higher as a driver. We can also look at the sentiment. So to help folks with colors, I added an additional color wheel here where we have some things that may have been mentioned at my Orchard's End establishment. So we have bent forks. Bent forks are not things that hobbits like. Then we have meat, where perhaps it's good that it's cooked. Sam likes that it's cooked. Gollum doesn't like it. It's negative. It's a little bit more controversial, more polarizing. Location at the top, which is either you love it or you hate it. No one's really absent of emotion about it. And we go price and service all the way down. This is one way that we've plotted specific mentions against other things, which could be helpful if you're looking for a deep dive on something specific. So in this example, bent forks by segment, you can take those sentiment calculations with polarizing and net negative and start to plot them against each other. So this is just one concept filtered for 4 different demographics. How do I make this resonate with my audiences? And it goes back to the research value cycle that I think we may be bringing up in almost every webinar, where it's going to depend on a lot of factors, right? It depends on what your leadership or the supply of the good or service needs and how well they're communicating that objective with you. So if they're trying to understand how to like optimize sales, or if they're trying to figure out how to improve accessibility, depending on what the objectives they're communicating are, or should help inform where you're collecting your data from. How are you asking the questions? Where, what platforms are you pulling the data from? What time you're pulling the data from? And then that's going to result in the feedback that you digest through daylight and which insights are going to be surfacing to be most effective with your leadership or internal stakeholders. We also want to use concept lists. So in daylight, you can save multiple concept lists, multiple shared views, and that can let you surface the subjects in drivers or with flavor, smell, foam, pour, filtered for specific products, and then show, well, for beer X, the flavor is good, the smell is good, the pour could be improved. It is not as good as this other one where it's a beautiful pour, but the flavor is a bit off. So that could be one that you want to take from the subjects and track in drivers or sentiment. Similarly, you can flip that and take some of the metrics from drivers or sentiment and plot them in volume. So if you want to see, well, for which beers is watery an issue? Which beers are being described as perfect? When is perfect being mentioned over time? Have we improved our formulation? Has the formulation been adjusted and no longer identified as perfect? If you want to view it, let's see, we did across time, we did across subsets, across scores. So if you want to see things like maybe oily was mentioned with a specific subset or in sentiment, it may have been mentioned across a variety of scores, but you want to see if it's being like how broad is that bell curve. We can see that in volume as well. So final things that we want to go over are how to uphold your research integrity. You want to be methodical, start with the end in mind, curate your data. If you're working with smaller data sets, running spell check can help consolidate the different spelling variations, which will make the concepts more crisp and accurate. We also want to carefully define the concepts. So when you're editing concepts, you may be adding a bunch of descriptions for the positive experience. You want to keep track of those conceptual matches and be extra careful when you're using the exclude function, because that will remove any documents that mention those specific things. So check your answers, do a gut check. Does this insight make sense? Does it track the narrative? Make sure the impression that you're getting aligns with the reality of the data. We don't want folks to go into daylight, find a surprise, report it as truth, and then find out it was a surprise because it was wrong. Research integrity is really, really important. If you get stuck, talk to experienced users. For those of you attending the webinar, recognizing more than a few of your faces, you guys are often the experienced users. Encourage other people using daylight to talk to you. And if you get stuck, reach out to us or the team. We have a whole swath of experienced users that are happy to help and check your work. It's okay to do that. Other videos, if you had a question but you were too shy to ask, that's totally okay. We have other videos on our YouTube page, including the feature overview that I hosted with our other CSM, John. And we have a list of timestamps in that video description, including how to configure visualization in volume, Galaxy driver sentiment, ways to use unique to filter and utilize score data in the science capacity. And we also have a video up there that was not a webinar. It's a short 5-minute video on suggested concepts. So if you want to understand how we are suggesting concepts, this goes over where those come from. Good seeing you all, and I'll talk to you all later. Have a good afternoon, everyone.